Hello, everyone. My name is Corey Diamond. I am the Senior Director of Development and Alumni Relations here at Fletcher. We are very excited to welcome people, alumni and students from around the world to this first ever virtual London Symposium. And we are very excited, obviously, for our special guest. Before we get to the main part of the program, just a few housekeeping notes. We will be taking questions after some introductory remarks. Please type your questions into the Q&A box on your screen. And then when we are ready to ask your question, we will call on you and you will be able to ask your question on camera. Please just keep entering the Q&A throughout and we will get through as many as we can. So before we start, I obviously would like to thank and introduce our special guest, Dame Karen Pierce, the British Ambassador to the United States. She has an incredibly impressive and voluminous biography, so I will hit, or background, I will hit a few of the highlights. She first joined the Foreign and Commonwealth Office in 1981, and her first role was in Tokyo. And her first posting to the United States was as private secretary to the British ambassador from 1992 to 1995. She returned to the UK for 10 years in various roles in 1996. And then in 2006 was posted again to New York to be the deputy permanent representative and ambassador at the UK mission to the United Nations. She had several other roles in Europe, and between 2015 and 16, she was the UK's ambassador to Afghanistan. And from 2018 to 2020, she was ambassador and permanent representative to the UK mission to the UN in New York. And in 2020 was named to her current role. And we are obviously very excited to have her here. And before we hear from her, I would like to turn it over to Dean Rachel Kyte.
Thank you, Corey, and welcome to everybody to this London seminar. It is the 18th London Symposium, first virtual, but 18th annual symposium. We launched in 2003 thanks to a group of alumni based in London. And key among them was Andre Van Doris, who founded and fostered this event over many years. He was a dear friend of the school, and I'm delighted that Jania Van Doris, his daughter, who I had the pleasure to meet in person a few times, saw last year, is with us today. So thank you very much. Thank you to the Van Doris family for their ongoing friendship to the school and their continued support. It's a real privilege for me to be able to welcome Dame Karen Pierce. As a British citizen, it is, I think, a real pleasure to see a number of key diplomatic posts in the British Foreign Service, now the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, to be occupied by extraordinary women diplomats, and premier amongst them is Karen Pierce. I was also privileged to be able to watch her close up at the United Nations from 2018 to 2020, particularly difficult time, as I think it was real pressure on the functionality of the Security Council, with a number of key players perhaps becoming somewhat semi-detached. Critical issues where Britain had the pen, including Yemen, critical issues of security and other conflicts around the world, and the growing drumbeat of pressure and anxiety around issues of peace and development, including climate change. Now, having moved from New York along the Acela down to Washington, Karen Pierce finds herself in the traditionally most important diplomatic posting within the British Foreign Service, in a capital which has gone under something of a diplomatic tumult in the last month, as a new administration has come into power, and President Biden seems to be signaling that the US is back, and back big, as a multilateral player. In the conversation just before we opened up to all of our participants, we were just commenting on how extraordinary just the last few days have been from a multilateral perspective. Munich Security Conference, the talks around the JCPOA, questions of climate change, where the UK has a leading role this year, and of course the UK presidency of the G7. So she is the right woman in the right place at the right time. We're delighted to have her with us. I'm going to hand it over to her now for a few comments, and then I'm going to use my position of privilege to ask a couple of questions myself, and then we'll open it up. But Karen Pierce is a distinguished diplomat, first woman to hold the post for the UK, and it's an extraordinary privilege to have you with us today. Please, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Dean Kyte. Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for joining. This is a great honour to be with the school. I've had many friends who very much enjoyed their time there, and I know the school has a very distinguished track record in many areas, particularly international relations and international politics. So thank you very much for asking me. And as Dean Kyte said, I do think yesterday, Friday, was an extraordinary day that probably did more than any other single moment to show how the world has changed since January the 20th. We had the US coming back into the Paris Climate Accord. We had at least 3 celebrations for that. I was lucky enough to take part in 2 of them with the Italian ambassador, with Secretary Kerry as the special COP envoy. We had the Munich Security Forum, where President Biden set out his view of foreign policy and his very welcome approach to both American leadership in the world and to alliances, where Boris Johnson said America is unreservedly back leading on the world stage. And that's something we attach huge importance to. And very much from the Prime Minister down, we see it as our role in Britain, consistent with our values and our interests, to burden share, to help problem solve, to be a global player. And perhaps we can come back to some of that later. So talking about the special relationship, a phrase Winston Churchill coined and repeated in his Fulton, Missouri speech, which was also famous for the words, the Iron Curtain. When President Biden first came into office, he made a number of phone calls, and for European leaders, he phoned Boris Johnson first, but when he phoned President Macron, he described France as America's oldest ally, which I think is true as a matter of historical record. But when he phoned Boris Johnson, he talked about Britain as America's closest ally. And you will all know from your various studies that this was absolutely not how it all began. After the War of Independence, there were some very tricky moments in US-UK relations, not least the burning of the White House, the storming of the Capitol in the War of 1812 to 1814. There were arguments on borders with Canada. There are arguments on borders in South America. There are arguments over the high seas. And then, as everybody knows, America generously came to Europe's rescue in World War I, and then itself went through a period of neutrality. But 1919 had shown the British that they needed to forge the closest possible relationship with the United States. And that has remained a plank of British foreign policy since. And we all know the story of the Second World War, what FDR did with Churchill, and how that out of that came the many great institutions that are still with us today. Some of them are more in need of reform than others, but we have the World Bank, the IMF, we have what became the WTO, and of course we have the United Nations, and then a few years later we have NATO, and all of those bodies saw the very closest cooperation between the UK and the US in setting them up. And so alongside the implicit US guarantee of security and prosperity, which has very generously stood behind those institutions on the whole since 1945. It's always an on the whole argument, but I think there's a definite trend there. Britain sees our role as helping the United States reform and modernize these institutions so they're fit for the 21st century. And one key plank of modernizing is to let other countries in and to give them their due weight and respect within these institutions, otherwise they won't thrive. And the other big plank which has very much featured in the conversations between President Biden and Boris Johnson to date, and was a very big theme in yesterday's G7 summit that Boris Johnson chaired. It's open societies. And open societies have been given not exactly a boost, but they have become more salient. That theme, democratic values, open markets, transparency between government and their citizens, given a very big boost by the COVID crisis and the comparison with authoritarian governments. And it's very much on our mind, it's very much on President Biden's mind, who's also thinking about a summit of democracies, that as we build back better from COVID, as we take economic recovery forward, we not only make that greener, and we not only try and smooth out some of the inequities and inequalities and injustices, but we actually do so in a way that really reinforces open societies as the model that will help countries thrive best in the modern world. And I'll come back to some of that in a moment on the special relationship. There was a very good article by Bob Zellick, who some of you may know, in the Financial Times the other day, talking about a role for Britain now we've left the European Union. And I think it would be very good if we were able in Britain to use this moment to answer that very famous American question, Britain's lost an empire and not yet found a role. You know, what is our role? And I come back to what I said at the beginning. It's to support American leadership in the world through problem solving, through being a global player, through being a champion of free markets. And I'm sure there'll be questions on that. But in his article, Bob Zellick had a brilliant quote from Alexander Hamilton, which was, "We think in English." And I think that's actually a very central point. If you think in English, you fundamentally approach things from a common law perspective. You approach them from the perspective of things are permissible unless they are expressly forbidden, and not the other way around. And that then leads you down a certain set of avenues all around freedom, free markets, open societies, which I think is really important. It also leads you to put huge amounts of emphasis on the rule of law, both at home and abroad. So there's a commonality there of purpose, but there's also a commonality of philosophy that goes back a very long way in US-UK relations. And it has underpinned the development of the UN, the development of NATO, the development of the WTO, but I think it also underpins day-to-day relations. And everybody, I suspect, is very familiar with the special relationship being all about defense, being about security, being about intelligence. That's a very firm, solid bedrock of the relationship that has endured definitely since the Second World War and before. We are, I think, the US only American ally that is a truly global player. We've just sent a carrier group to the Indo-Pacific. Like the Biden administration's pivot to the Indo-Pacific, we also see this area as critical to global stability and security, and also to prosperity. It's very important to keep navigation channels open. Of course, Britain is much smaller than the US, so our role in that is commensurate with size. But in terms of determination and in terms of what we see as a responsibility to promote stability, we're right up there with the United States under President Biden. I think the other thing I'd highlight is the prosperity side. It isn't just about the bedrock of the security side of the relationship, critical as that is. One of the reasons British and American prosperity, commercial relations are so intertwined is precisely this approach towards free markets and the approach towards common law and the ability to go to court to protect your investments. And that's been a very central part of building up both our economies to the point where over 1 million Americans go to work each day for British companies, and over 1 million Brits go to work each day for American companies. And trade between the two of us in aggregate amounts to something like $800 billion a year. And we very much hope to be able to build on that with a free trade agreement later this year. Now, that's not straightforward with a new administration. We will have to wait till Catherine Tai, the new USTR, is confirmed and be able to talk to her about how she sees that unfolding. There's also the expiration of Trade Promotion Authority later this year, which are complicating factors. But nevertheless, that free trade agreement, whether or not we embellish it, augment it with more labour and environment provisions, which was done in USMCA, we'd be very apt for having a conversation on that. But I think the central point about that FTA is that it's very important for small and medium-sized enterprises on which both the US and UK economies depend. And that in turn is very relevant to COVID recovery. It's also would be the first free trade agreement to properly go into measures to enhance digital and e-commerce. So in that sense, it might form something of a template or a blueprint for future trade agreements. And I think that's symbolic of something else that really characterizes the US-UK special relationship. It's the drive for innovation. It's the desire to build on what we've got and develop something new and enhance that and keep moving forward. And the science and research cooperation between the US and UK is second to none. And we recently signed a memorandum of understanding that will deepen that relationship still further. But I wanted to spend some time today talking about the special relationship in a new area. You know, we're very used to shared endeavors in war and peace. We're very used to forging a common purpose to tackle new challenges, whether those challenges are strategic competition from China, whether they're climate, where we are working very closely with the new administration to raise the level of ambition for COP26 in Glasgow, whether they are the challenges, as I said earlier, of reforming these big international institutions. But I think there's one challenge that we need to meet together that is new. And this is new technology, new disruptive technology. I think everyone appreciates that we stand on the threshold of what has been called the fourth industrial revolution. Whether it is or not, I think it's indisputable that the developments in new technology, in AI, in quantum, in cyber, even in space, will be transformative. And the way I tend to think of this, and I don't think this is too fanciful, I think of this in terms of it's like nuclear was in the 1950s. It requires a whole new set of thought processes and philosophies. It requires a whole new approach to regulation. It requires a whole new approach to scientific development. And if I look back at how we got to the bedrock of the special relationship of defense and security and intelligence, a lot of it was formalized in 1958 with something called the Mutual Defense Agreement. And I think of technology in very similar terms. I think to bring all our science and innovation together, to put what the commercial world is doing in touch with what the defense world is doing, we need something of that sort of framework to help guide all our work. And actually, it's not an exclusively US-UK enterprise by any means. One of the motivations for President Biden's Summit of Democracies, the motivation for Boris Johnson wanting to bring other countries into the G7 meetings later this year, is to make sure that we win the strategic competition on technology. And that sounds pretty aggressive. And I don't really mean it to be aggressive, except in one respect. The Secretary General of the UN has been talking for several years now about we don't want to wake up in a world that has two parallel systems. One of them led by the United States, technology open, multi-sector, multi-stakeholder, multi-sector for the benefit of citizens, and the other authoritarian, where technology is fundamentally used by governments to spy on their citizens. We very much want to do everything we can to increase the prospects for the former, and that, in the view of Boris Johnson and President Biden, means bringing together the democratic but also technically advanced countries, working out how we can leapfrog on 5G to the next generation, working out how we use all these interesting new technologies in a way that will help us build back better, will help us build back greener, and critically will help overcome some of the disparities in society. So I think that is the new area, if you like, for the special relationship. And then as far as my work goes, and that of the embassy and our consulates round the US, we have some 7 consulate generals around the US and a couple of small one-person offices. There's something very important about building on the ties we already have, people to people, but also being able to develop new relationships and introduce new generations of Brits and Americans to each other. I think it's probably fair to say that compared to 25 years ago when I was first here, fewer younger people in both countries know as much about their counterparts or have a personal connection to Europe or the UK compared to 25 years ago. So we actively, as an embassy, we actively want to go out and look for ways of bringing people together, whether that's through creative industries, whether it's through more scholarships, whether it's through finding joint enterprises that we can do together. So if anybody in the audience has ideas to that effect, I would very much like to hear them. So thank you very much for inviting me today. Really a great pleasure to have the opportunity to talk about this issue. I'm very happy to take questions.
Well, thank you very much. It was a wonderful sort of tour of the horizon, and really interesting to think about what this new era will be at the cusp of a 4th industrial revolution. So that's kind of where I want to ask my first question, which is, and you didn't mention the word Brexit, right? I think we're all probably tired of enunciating it, but it seems to me that, and you talked about how the role of the UK is to help the US sort of with the shared values, with the shared sort of thought processes, reform and reshape the institutions that were created more than 75 years ago, fit for purpose for this modern world, you know, how to build the norms, the philosophy, the standards that we will need for managing technology in this new era. So this is a grand enterprise, and works, I think, where there's a US administration where you can find a diplomatic grabbing hold, I suppose. I think my impression was that over the last 4 years, and your credentials were presented to the previous president, there was some heartburn on both sides of the Atlantic, I think, when it didn't, you know, there was the UK trying to sort of use the relationship to understand what was going on, nudge what was going on, prevent the worst from happening in some cases, but didn't have that grab, wasn't able to sort of grab on and hold on quite so easily. Zelig, in that wonderful piece, the best boss I ever had, right, talked about how the US can help the UK, right? So sort of an interesting juxtaposition. But in global Britain, if Britain is on its own now, sort of between the EU and the US, we all think in English, we have this familiarity, we have all of these deep economic and cultural ties as well as security and political ties. Where do we get used by the Americans then as a sort of nimble, agile, very, very important power, but slightly smaller one? We were used clearly to influence the EU when we were part of the EU. So how does Brexit sort of put an additional, has it made it more complex for you, or it's just different complexity?
Wow, there's a lot there. I think the first thing to say that America is an extraordinarily generous and altruistic nation when it comes to abroad. But she's also very ruthless about her own interests. And that's true under Biden. It's different, but it's as true under Biden as it was under any of his predecessors, including Trump. And I think there is no doubt that when Britain was in the European Union, certain things were easier for the administration of the day, whoever it is, because they had a way of influencing the EU on things like open markets. That's a good one. And it's not, I want to stress, it's not that Britain did America's bidding, it's that Britain and America think more similarly, not in every case, but on the whole, it's not on the whole. On the whole, Britain and America think more similarly about security and about free markets than most of the rest of the EU. And therefore, with Britain in the EU, if you like, American interests were to a certain extent defended, because they were our interests and the interests of the Northern and Eastern Europeans. And without that, of course, America will have to find new ways and new partners to look after its interests in the EU. And I personally don't think that that means one single country to replace the UK. I think America will need to diversify because for obvious reasons, other EU countries aren't quite like the UK. They don't have the, if they have the free trade credentials, they don't have the security capabilities. So I think America will need to diversify, and I think that's fine. I think as far as we go, it's very much in our interest, but it's in America's and the EU's interest as well, that from time to time, there are mechanisms and fora where the US, UK, and the EU all come together. So I could think of WTO and multilateral reform in that context. I could think of dealing with China in that context. You know, it's true that the EU is the world's third largest economy, but the UK is the world's fifth largest economy. Some figures would say the sixth, but the point is it's a very serious economy. And the importance of that is that if you want to move the dial on some of these really big issues with China, then a transatlantic partnership is the best way to do it. And, you know, obviously there will be some areas where the US has talks with the EU, there'll be some areas where the US has talks with the UK, and there'll be some areas where the UK has talks with the EU. But my point is, from time to time, we need to bring all that together. If you're looking at human rights and security, again, you need to bring all that together. The EU has very deep interests and direct interests in what happens in North Africa, say, and the UK and the US are both players in that. So I don't think I think the day-to-day is very different, but I don't think the strategic orientation is different, to be absolutely honest. But I also agree with Dr. Kissinger, when he says America's a different country if it's hooked to Europe. And I think the UK forms one of those hooks outside the European Union. It just, as we were saying earlier, just means you come to it in a slightly different way. I think the nimble and agile bit is really, for me, the most interesting. You could see this at the UN. Because we are one of the most free trade, actually, to be honest, we are the most free trade country compared to the EU, and always were. We also are pretty nimble on human rights, and we now have our own Magnitsky sanctions. And this enables us to react much faster to developments in the world, e.g. on Myanmar, that Dominic Raab and the Canadian Foreign Minister announced recently, following what President Biden had done a few days earlier. That agility is really, really helpful because it can be turned up and it can be turned down according to circumstance. If you look at the EU, by definition, 27, the legislative side of it is more complicated. The EU, by definition, will be slower to act. But when it does act, it acts across a bigger scale and it can act for longer. So I think that's another reason to have these transatlantic cooperation mechanisms. US, UK, Canada, fast, nimble, react immediately. EU comes along with more blockbuster sanctions. If we want to send a small signal of welcome for a good move, for the sake of argument that Myanmar might make, US, UK, Canada can take off sanctions very quickly, but the big EU ones stay. So I think we can put this to really good advantage. It will take some working out and it will take some habits of cooperation, but I actually think this is a huge plus in foreign policy.
So interesting. So many sort of plates, tectonic plates moving at the same time. So I've got one little cute question. I'm going to save it to the end if we've got time. And we've got so many great questions coming into the Q&A. I'm going to hand over to Corey, who's going to moderate this now. But I think it's going to be a great discussion. Thank you.
Great, thanks.
Great, thank you. And again, please keep entering your questions, and I will call on you and just take a second, and you can then ask your question on camera. So first, we will go to Tom Phillips.
Muted.
Yes, please remember to unmute.
Tom Phillips here, Karen. Just to say congratulations on the job. Can I just ask a question? I'd like to ask about I was intrigued that you mentioned UN Security Council reform as one of the things on the agenda. You and I know how complex that's been in the past. Is there any risk that reopening that issue at the moment will put something of a quizzical spotlight on the UK's right to a seat post-Brexit, and particularly if Scotland were to leave the rest of the UK and would become rump UK? Will some say it should be India, it should be Japan, it should be whoever, but it shouldn't be the UK anymore, and France is the voice of the EU? Thanks.
Hi, Tom. Nice to see you. That's a great question. I actually meant UN reform as a whole. But you're right to ask about the Security Council. Fundamentally, the Security Council can't be reformed unless every single one of the P5 agrees it can. So to be really crude about it, we have a veto over our own future, which is helpful. But I think in philosophical terms, the people who are most at risk of the EU seat argument are now the French. They're very exposed because they haven't got the UK arguing against that concept with them. And if anybody doubts this, they should take a look at what happened when the Germans suggested there should be an EU seat on the Security Council. And the strongest and fastest and most outraged arguments came from Paris. And there was a big Le Monde op-ed about it. So I don't think that side of it is a problem. I do think it's very difficult to get Security Council reform because there are so many equities, not so much on the part of P5, though those are real, and the Chinese are very, very wary of Security Council reform. It's because the other blocs in the General Assembly can't reach agreement on a common position. And at the moment, that is stymieing the ability of UN members to be able to chart a way forward. So, for example, the so-called G4, Germany, Japan, Brazil, India, they would be willing to come onto the Security Council as permanent members without the veto. But the African countries have not yet, I think, taken a view among themselves as to which of their members would be the most likely or the most deserving of a Security Council permanent seat. But the African position is that you can't have interim permanent membership. You have to have the veto from day one. And fundamentally, those two things need resolving. There's also a constituency in the General Assembly whereby, excuse me, all the close neighbours of the four countries I mentioned are the ones least enthusiastic, to put it no harder, about their neighbours getting permanent membership. So all these equities fundamentally need to be brought into the open and debated. It is the British and French position that we would support expansion of the Security Council permanent membership to the 4. I mentioned plus 2 seats for Africa, but we're not closer as the UN to being able to resolve the detail.
Great, thank you very much. The next question will be from Donald Ross.
Okay, am I now unmuted?
Yes, go ahead, thank you.
Okay, it took a moment to figure out how to do that. And now I've lost my video. Sorry.
There we go.
I'm back. Okay. I'm more trying to find the bottom of the screen here so I could get to the question I wrote. But okay. I'm interested in education abroad bilaterally, and the COVID crisis has really impacted student mobility and faculty mobility. So I was wondering if you could comment on the future you see of student and faculty studying in either of our 2 countries, and how you could promote the restarting with all the travel restrictions and all of such exchanges and mutual beneficial living and learning in another country like you've been able to do. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I mean, it's so important. My husband spent time at Harvard, so we have personal experience of what you say, and I agree it's extremely important. But unfortunately, it has been a casualty of COVID. Within the UK, we did try and open up schools and universities, and unfortunately, it proved that was contributing to the spread of COVID. So a lot of them have gone back to virtual schooling. We hope to open up schools later this year, later in summer. In general terms, I'd like to see more scholarships in the STEM field in particular, and more of those interchange schemes whereby universities arrange for their students to spend, say, a year of their course in the other country. And I know that happens in both directions. We have our Marshall Scholarship program. We need to see what the economic situation is like as we recover from COVID, but we would very much like to be able to expand that. And of course, there's the Rhodes program as well, and quite a few members of the new administration are Rhodes or Marshall scholars. And that's been really important. The Germans have the German Marshall Fund. They were both set up as thank yous to America for the contribution for the Marshall Plan. But we'd like to expand them if we can. And as I say, we'd like to take them into new areas. And in keeping with what I was saying about the embassy's aim to try and forge new young people to people links, I do think we need to do more to move these programs into a more diverse space and get a greater range of communities, including disadvantaged and ethnic minority communities. As it happens, this year's group of Marshall scholars is the most diverse we've ever had. And I think I'm right in saying that we have more ethnic minority students this year, the majority of the scholars. So that's all fantastic, but it just shows that there's a lot more we could be doing and a lot more on that. I think the Zoom culture that you get with the pandemic has probably pointed the way for some interesting collaborative opportunities without having to move school children across the Atlantic. I would think that it was possible for schools to do things like model United Nations by Zoom. That might be quite interesting. It might enable more schools and school children to be exposed to that sort of thing. I think it's certainly something we should look at from a cultural perspective. And there aren't any concrete plans right now, but I think in general terms, we very much endorse what you say about the value of this. And I agree, we should try and put some of that into action.
Great, thank you. Next, we will go to Ted Johnson.
Good morning. Am I?
You're on, go ahead.
Good morning, and thank you so much for your presentation and the outlook that you have. I am teaching in a program on conflict and coexistence, conflict resolution and coexistence, and particularly concerned, or at least interested in your view of the situation in Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, and was curious about whether you have some idea in your mind of the particular challenges facing the two, and if there is a potential for coexistence, and whether also you are optimistic about a peaceful and coexistent outcome.
Thank you very much. I'm going to start by saying I'm always optimistic. Someone has to be optimistic. I'm always at the optimistic end of the spectrum. It's a very interesting question. Thank you. Northern Ireland has a special place in the agreement that the UK reached with the EU on the future relationship. And when the Foreign Secretary visited Washington in September, there was a lot of concern at the time, including from people like Congressman Richie Neal, who chairs the Ways and Means Committee, and Speaker Nancy Pelosi, a lot of concern that the deal with the European Union would somehow call into question the border, particularly whether or not a hard border would need to come back because of customs and trade between Northern Ireland and the EU as represented by Ireland, and what that would all mean. And I think at the time, Richie Neal said, if there's any detriment to the Good Friday Agreement, then Congress won't pass a free trade agreement with the UK. So I'm very pleased to say, at the time, the government was very clear about its commitment to the Good Friday Agreement. That commitment is absolute. There will not be a hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. The agreement with the EU was then reached between the UK and the EU in December. The new system is in operation. We can make good on that commitment in concrete terms, in that the arrangements do not include a hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. The Good Friday Agreement is upheld in toto. The goods themselves go through a system at the port of Larne that's quite complicated, but not unmanageable. This is called the Northern Ireland Protocol. There's a joint commission that looks after this protocol and the status of Northern Ireland. Fundamentally, Northern Ireland defies the laws of physics and is in two places at once, within the EU single market and obviously within the United Kingdom single market. And then these special arrangements apply on regulatory matters like phytosanitary matters. Now, it's something we're still talking to the Irish in Dublin and the EU about, because as part of the COVID vaccine debate, when supplies were fragile for the European Union a few weeks ago, the European Union invoked what's called Article 16 of this Northern Ireland Protocol, which fundamentally suspends, overrides the operation of the protocol. And they did that to stop vaccines going to Northern Ireland and in their eyes, moving away out of the European Union. The Irish government were on this like a flash. They were lobbying Mrs. van der Leyen not to do that and to rescind the Article 16 order. We were lobbying as well, obviously, as you'd expect. And I'm glad to say that we were both successful and the EU changed its mind about Article 16. But I mention it to show how fragile some of these issues can be. And then, of course, when you get an issue like that, it has a psychological effect on the communities. And as you also know, the Good Friday Agreement is keeping north-south and east-west in some sort of balance, so that all communities feel protected, they feel respected, and it's very easy for something like that vaccines debate to tip things. But the British government's commitment to the Good Friday Agreement is rock solid, the Irish government's as well, and there has never been an effect on the ability of people to move backwards and forwards between Northern Ireland and Ireland. That free movement of people predates entry into the EU. It predates, obviously, Britain's leaving the EU, and it will continue.
Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. The next question is from Steve Jaskowski.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. I would like to ask what, in the context of the Fourth Industrial Revolution and US-UK sort of coordinated positions, where you think the appropriate venues for reform or developing norms in cyberspace may be. And I'll draw a leading question, perhaps World Trade Organization reform or intellectual property organization. I'd like your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much. I think that's a really interesting question. The answer is we don't know yet. I mean, the honest answer is we don't know yet. We have to develop the structures and the frameworks. There are two broad ways of doing it. One is to use existing organizations like WTO and WIPO, World Intellectual Property Organization. You could have a plurilateral organization in the way that we do on government procurement, say, and that could come under one of those organizations, but be open to a range of countries. You could negotiate it as a freestanding resolution agreement within the United Nations itself, the General Assembly, or you could have a series of smaller agreements in various other relevant organizations. And there are various merits of either of of any of those courses of action. What has tended to happen to date is that new weapons systems, drones, are covered by existing international law, even though they're a different sort of weapon. Fundamentally, they're covered, say, by international humanitarian law or the laws of war. So there is a school of thought that that's what happens with things like cyber. You make sure existing law encompasses the areas of cyber that are most likely to be developed. I myself think, but it deserves some international study, that with something like cyber and quantum and AI, that's just not going to be possible. And that the offensive capability of cyber means that one would need something stronger. But that's not, I couldn't pretend that was a properly thought through government position. I think it's one of the things we need to study alongside with quite a few other bits of the international legal system to make sure that it is fully fit for a world where there are many more non-state actors than there were when the UN and the IFIs were created. So I think it's a good question on which we need to do a lot more thinking. And it is conceivable, I don't think we'll end up going down this route, but it is conceivable that you would have a special form of arbitration that might deal with cases like this. But it's a great question. It is one of the things we need to think about for what architecture do we need for the next 10 years and beyond.
Great, thank you very much. Next, we will go to Tatiana.
Okay, start my video.
Go ahead.
My question is not there. I can't see it, but I will ask it as well as I can. I come from the state of Texas, part of the Bible Belt, from which the first American ambassador to the United Kingdom went, and that was Anne Armstrong. And Fletcher has started having an interest in the role of religion in international affairs. I wanted to know what the ambassador thinks of a possible positive role of religious leaders in international affairs.
I know I've met Ambassador Armstrong, so that's very nice to hear. This is on the record, so I'm not going to give you my unvarnished view of the role of religion in international affairs, I'm afraid. We often get this question at the UN, and we often try very hard as the UK to work with organisations like Sant'Egidio and others. And the Archbishop of Canterbury, Bishop of Goma, they have done some fantastic work in the DRC to try and bring religious leaders together to support peace initiatives. I remember when I worked on Bosnia, again, the race at the time, some very, very good work to bring people together. But then we also know that these good people have counterparts who, though religious, actually spend a lot of their time stoking up division rather than trying to heal it. So I think it is not, it's not an issue without its consequences. But there are certainly ways in the UN and other bodies like the OSCE to bring religious leaders together to try and help promote political processes, to try and bring communities together. So I think the answer really is it depends. It's a case-by-case thing. Sometimes it can be very helpful. Sometimes it sets up so much oppositional feeling that you need to tread very warily. But there are some good mechanisms that deliberately try and bring religious leaders together to this purpose. And in fact, the Archbishop of Canterbury is involved in some of those. And I'm speaking to him next week about this very point.
Okay, next question will be Peter Kessler.
Okay, sorry about that. Great. sorry about that. Greetings from Bethnal Green. I have a question about the UK's. The UK has had some very excellent de-radicalization programs and supporting individuals to re-engage in society. But at the same time, of course, in our community, we have seen some individuals recruited by ISIS and travel to Syria. Among them, of course, women or individuals, even girls who subsequently married and had children. And of course, the UK is not alone in that. Other countries like Russia, Kazakhstan have taken some of their civilians back from Al-Hol and Raj camps in northern Syria. I'm wondering if you can see the UK taking the step to bring back some of its citizens. because of course there remain a great many people there, and not just from the UK, but from many other countries, Canada, the US, Trinidad and Tobago. And do you foresee any opportunities for a Biden administration in coming years to also take similar steps to rescue its citizens and minor children from these sites in Syria?
Well, thank you for the question. So on the children specifically, the UK does have a programme to evaluate and bring back orphaned minority children. And in fact, a colleague of mine has actually gone out to bring some of these children back after various negotiations and things. So that programme exists. On the broader question, it's my understanding that the US does repatriate its nationals along with Russia and, as you say, Kazakhstan. Whether or not these people want to be repatriated back to Russia, I think is an interesting question, and it's not clear what happens after they get back to Russia. But it's also true that for European countries, including the UK, excuse me, the question is a complicated one, and we have tended to take the view that if a prosecution is in order, so this obviously doesn't apply to the children, but if it's a case of prosecution, that is better done as close to where the evidence is as possible, which would mean in country or in Iraq, say. And that in itself brings complications because it's got to then fit with that country's law and legal system. So a lot of conversations and discussions have gone on between European governments and regional governments about whether some sort of reasonable justice can be devised in country. But it's very much a live debate. There is no simple answer, I'm afraid. It's one of those genuine policy dilemmas where governments just have to keep evaluating the pros and cons of different sorts of action. You're right about the de-radicalization programs. Some of them have been very effective. I don't think anyone has yet done one at scale. And the International Committee of the Red Cross is very interesting on this. It is, they believe that in some ways the women and the children are the hardest to de-radicalize. Not in every case, but again, I come back to the fact that there are some very real policy issues here that we are trying with European and other partners to resolve. So I'm sorry, it's not a complete answer, but I can assure you it's got a lot of attention and people are working very hard on what we do.
Thank you.
Great, we're getting close to the end, and I think Dean Kyte, you had a couple more questions for the ambassador.
Thank you. Yeah, I thank you very much, and I think there's it's such a wide-ranging conversation. I had two sort of bringing it back to the role of ambassador at this point in time, and my first one is your predecessor Kim Darroch stepped aside after a leak of diplomatic cables, and I know we're on the record, so that's I don't expect too much in the answer, but I think did that have a chilling effect on you and your colleagues, and how does I mean, obviously there was an investigation and everything, but how do you pick up from that? I mean, did you have concerns coming into the role that lightning could strike twice?
Yes, to be absolutely honest, but it isn't twice. It would be 5 or 6 times. Not with Kim, obviously, but with Kim and my predecessors. There are just some people around who are not helpful in government when it comes to things like this, and who don't think about the overall effect on the bilateral relationship, and for some reason pursue a course of action that's illegal and unhelpful. But it was made very clear at the time that Kim resigned that it was the duty of all ambassadors to give ministers their frank and honest impressions of the countries they live in, and the governments and other people that they deal with. So that's our standard. I think it would be fair to say that probably the distribution lists are not as wide as they used to be, but it still is our job to give governments unvarnished assessments of what we're picking up and what we're being told. So that's what we do.
And so actually, maybe I just give the, I don't know if we can still do this technically, but there's a question coming from Arsen Khan. Can Arsen ask his question? Ask a question, sorry. Arsen, the floor is yours.
Looks like he's not online anymore, actually.
I'm here.
Hey, hi, there you go.
Sorry for the appearance. No, I put in a question in the Q&A by text, and I was asking, well, you know, do you think that the UK will ever, you know, acknowledge its colonial past and you know, maybe apologize for some of the legacy that exists, especially, you know, in this new configuration of Brexit going forward? Do you think that, you know, the UK might need to reposition itself vis-a-vis the developing world and its historical colonial subjects? Over.
Wow, there's a lot there. For individual acts, the British government, various British governments have apologised. The one that springs most readily to mind is David Cameron apologising for Bloody Sunday. In general terms, the UK has a very good relationship with developing countries. If you go to the UN, you will actually find developing countries coming up saying we want the UK to play more of a role. We want you to take the lead on things like rule of law. That's how we think of the Brits. We think of the Brits as problem solvers. We think of you as a global leader on rule of law. We want you to do much more on this and work with us. And we definitely have an ambition to extend our partnerships as we try and help solve some of the big global challenges. And I think it's true to say that the West is very good at talking to itself about these problems, and we need to broaden our partnerships and talk with people as well who don't agree with us and find common ground where we can. The Commonwealth is very important, I think, in this question. They are all linked by having once been members of the British Empire. Very few countries leave the Commonwealth, most still stay in it, which I think is a vote of confidence about the relationship. But within that, the British government has been ready to take individual areas. If one thinks of same-sex marriage, same-sex relationships, Theresa May at the last big Commonwealth meeting in the UK made a commitment that the British government will help any Commonwealth country who wants to amend its colonial era legislation. It's quite striking how many countries have on the books legislation from the colonial era that is anti-LGBTQ. And we are ready to assist those countries if they would like it in amending their legislation. And I think if that went well, it's possible it could be extended to other areas. I don't know the take-up rate, I'm afraid, but it was an attempt to recognise some particular problem and put that right.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah, we could probably have a seminar just on that question alone, as many of the other questions. So my last really sort of soft lob question to you, Ambassador, is last weekend, Boris Johnson described the events of January the 6th and the aftermath here in the United States as a kerfuffle, which sent many Americans to their dictionary to just work out exactly what a kerfuffle meant. Did you get lots of phone calls?
No, we didn't get any. Sorry about that. But I think it's also worth recalling that when it happened, the Prime Minister said the effects were disgraceful. So I don't want people taking the word kerfuffle and trying to work out if it's stronger or less strong than disgraceful. I think our views are well on record. It was disgraceful. It shouldn't have happened. Congress was trying to discharge its electoral responsibilities, its constitutional responsibilities. In the end, thankfully, Congress was able to do that. We have enormous sympathy for the victims of the police officers who died and those who were heroic. Shocking to see what was done inside the Capitol by a mob. The Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, is very hot on the rule of law. You know, you don't just take the law into your own hands. He's always been very against that. And we've been in touch with many members of Congress, including Speaker Pelosi and the majority and minority leaders, about what happened. And, you know, I think Boris Johnson said that for all his life, America had been a beacon of democracy. And that's true of me as well. And that's, you know, that's what we believe in. That's what we saw reinstated, if you like, after the riots. President Biden was sworn in. It's a new era. But it's a reminder of how some of this stuff lurks beneath the surface and is very quickly brought to the surface. So we've lots of work to do on unity and on making sure that all citizens really are equal before the law.
Well, thank you very much. It's been just a pleasure to see you. Pleasure to talk to you again. I'm going to hand back to Corey to sign off. But thank you, and I hope that when COVID lifts the restrictions, maybe one day we get you to campus, and I certainly look forward to calling on you in Washington. So back to Corey. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you.
Yes, thank you to Dean Kyte. Thank you to Dean Kyte, obviously, and to Ambassador Pierce. It was a fascinating conversation. Thank you to everyone for joining us. We will have more events coming up over the next few months, so please look for that. And hopefully we will see everyone in person in London for the symposium next year. Thank you again. Have a great day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.